Since For Honor's release, there has been a lot of discussion about who would win if this fictional war between the knights, Vikings, and samurai came to pass. Now, one thing that became apparent to me in this discussion is that most of the knowledge we're all spouting as fact online is actually completely false or informed by, our favourite anime or TV show. Knowing this, I took it upon myself to track down experts in Viking, samurai, and medieval knight history in order to ask them the big questions that we as a gaming community are discussing ourselves. Today, in part 2 of my discussion with Dr Jonathan Clements, our samurai expert, there's two topics that I really wanted to tackle. The first one was whether this honourable duelling culture of the samurai is a myth based on what we've already discovered, what we've already talked about. And the other topic is actually quite appropriate now that Season 2 has launched, and that is whether the ninja, the shinobi, actually existed in the way that we all believe they did. One thing I do want to say just before we jump into this is that it's really encouraging, it's really cool to see the discussion that's going on in the comments, both here on YouTube, over on Twitter, and on the For Honor subreddit as well. One thing that Jonathan has said is that if you guys have any rebuttals, any questions based on what he said, let me know down in the comments here on YouTube, and once the interview footage is all gone live, I'll send these questions over to Jonathan. He'll give me a written answer, and we'll actually do a follow-up video on this as well, because it seems that the samurai, as a topic, there's a lot of passionate people when it comes to samurai. But if you've any questions for Jonathan that you would like to field to him, let me know down in the YouTube comments. But folks, once again, sit back, get a cup of tea, enjoy the interview. If statistically most samurai are dying by arrow and then obviously later musket than they are by sword, would it be correct of us to assume that this kind of idyllic dueling culture that we see so much in pop culture of the samurai is incorrect?
Well, that's a long answer. Luckily we've got the concept. This is a historiographical question, we see, which is why I get all nerdy and excited. Because what we have to separate is what really happened on the samurai battlefield during the samurai era from what happened in the sagas that were written about them later on. And the two great periods for the Monogatari, and the Gunkimon, or the war chronicles of the samurai, as with the Vikings and frankly as with the knights, the Crusaders, were after the actual battle period was done. And so you have this massive civil war between the Taira and the Minamoto, and then 100 years later everyone writes it down and tells all these stories about it, some of whom have never left their armchair and have no clue about what happens on the battlefield. Then you have another massive civil war, the Sengoku, which was won by the Tokugawa shogunate, and then you have a 200-year period where everybody tells legends and stories about it and works their ancestors in to make it look like they were there. And so it's impossible to give you a direct answer on this, because sometimes you have actual battlefield situations. Sometimes you have battlefield situations where the people turning up for the battle have only read chronicles about battles and assume that there's going to be some kind of duel-y standoff. The best example I can give is when the Mongols invaded. When Kublai Khan sent his big armada and they landed on the coast of Kyushu, and a samurai rode out in typical samurai style, and he said, "Hi, my name is Dave Samurai, and I'm the son of him, and I'm the daughter, and my mum's pretty hard too, and we fought well at the battle of this and the battle of that, and anyway, and I'm here calling out any one of you who thinks you can." And he got to that point, and then about 400 arrows, poisoned arrows, as it happened, come flying out of the Mongol army and turn him into a pincushion, and the Japanese were absolutely disgusted at this kind of behavior, because that's not how you do stuff.
Of course not.
So certainly during certain periods of the samurai era, battles would occur that began with the two armies facing. I assume this is what you're describing when you say duel. The two armies face each other, and then they send some champions out and they have a bit of a fight. And they have a few more champions come out and have a bit of a fight, and a few more, and eventually it turns into this huge melee. At some point there's an exchange of arrows, which is the kind of thing that's going to cause most of the deaths. My problem with this as a historian, as a historiographer, is that the person who tells you this story wasn't there.
Yeah.
And what you're getting is someone says, oh, what the protocols are of battle were established, and that is what's supposed to happen. Would that be what actually happened in the majority of cases? I wouldn't bet on it. There are cases from Japan's Civil War of samurai turning up, sending their champions out, and going, okay, if we agree that we won, we'll give you 2 days to get away, and we'll report to the shogun it was a victory. And they go, cool. And that's the battle done. And this was very controversial in the 15th century that someone would actually do this. But they were all related to each other, and they were friends, and they were ordered by the shogun to find. Let's just agree amongst ourselves that this was our day. Next week you come back, and we'll say that we won. So that you get that kind of brinksmanship and that kind of diplomacy as well. And so when it comes to the specific mechanics of duels, when you are a storyteller or a bard and you're telling the story of a battle, it's really helpful if you can zero in on specific incidents and specific people. Partly because in terms of basic narrative, it's much better if you can give you someone to identify with. You're still thinking about Dave Samurai, my made-up Mongol fighting guy, and I made him up. If I hadn't given him a name, then maybe he would have kind of faded away by now. But also, we have to remember that the bards and the storytellers who are telling these stories are telling them, as did Viking as did Viking skalds, they're telling them to an audience of people who may have been there or whose dad was, and so it's a kind of shout out to the crew. Definitely, Dave Samurai was definitely there, and he died very, very nobly, with all those bows and arrows in him. So when the duels are described in that way. That is another factor. The final thing I would say about it is that once we move into the Tokugawa period from 1603 to 1868, we are dealing with a drift from battlefield tactics, from the actual practicalities of killing people, to what is now known as the sportification of martial arts. It used to be popular to say that what used to be jutsu, kyujutsu, kenjutsu, and Bojutsu transformed into do, kendo, kyudo, and the reason is that the do suffix becomes a kind of sport. There's a set of rules. There's a set of areas where you're supposed to do it. You're not allowed to gouge people's eyes out anymore. These kind of rules enter the fray, and so because what you have in the Tokugawa period, for those that don't know, is the samurai win. The Tokugawa shogunate wins at the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, and the Tokugawa family is then shogun, is then the de facto ruler of Japan in the emperor's name for the next 250 years. And so 10% of the population of Japan are samurai. They are the aristocracy, and they've got nobody left to fight, even though they have a compulsory training regime as if they're under a constant state of battle readiness. And so you have, and when I wrote my book about the Shimabara Rebellion, it took place in 1638, which was 2 decades after the siege of Osaka Castle. So there was an entire generation of young samurai who'd never fought before. And they were desperate to get into battle, partly because they thought war was going to be fun, and they wanted to, but also it was their job, it was what they were supposed to do. And most importantly is that most of them rightly suspected this would be the last battle that was fought in their lifetime, and their chance for a battlefield promotion was next Tuesday. That's it. That's the only chance that you've got. So all of these factors tend to influence things on the battlefield. The problem with nobility and the sense, I'm sure we'll talk about nobility more later on, but the problem with the rules of dueling is they're often established after the fact by the winners, and the Tokugawa were the winners for 250 years, desperately trying to keep the samurai busy. And of course what you had, I don't know if you are aware of this, but Japan in the 1630s voluntarily entered a time warp. The Tokugawa shogunate locked away all the muskets. They gave up the gun. And Japan basically returned to medieval technology. There were gun emplacements on the coast in case of foreign invaders, which slowly fell apart and never really got used. But basically, Japan was in this consensual time warp for 250 years, with the samurai still pretending it was 1570. And it's one of the amazing things about Japan. And of course, it's one of the things that really makes Japan's entry into the Western world after the 1850s such a huge deal, because basically you've got these people living in the Middle Ages, and then the Americans turn up in these steamships, like flying saucers landing on the lawn, and say, guess what? While you were asleep, the Industrial Revolution's happened. And it's this kind of culture shock that defines much of Japan's transformation in the late 19th and early 20th century. But that's another story.
Yeah. We kind of, I guess, answered, could samurai weaponry pierce or do any damage to chainmail or plate mail?
Well, let's be more specific about it. Let's deal with that. I don't want to be the guy that says no. I don't want to be that irritating guy that you bring in that starts 10 more fights on the internet. I think with a following wind, at the right angle, at the right moment, a samurai arrow, particularly one of the long pointy ones designed for armor piercing, or the point of a wakizashi, or possibly even a katana, possibly even a tachi, which is a variant with a pointier end, would make it through chainmail. I think that's true. However, it's kind of a laboratory condition question there, because to put yourself in that position where you can punch a hole through the mail is going to be difficult. Something that I wanted to say right at the beginning, and I found it's probably now is the best time to bring it up, is the real problem with the for honor questions. Is that if you want to put the samurai and the knights and the Vikings in the same space, you also have to put them in the same time. And this is a big issue for me in terms of talking about the technology, because firstly, you've got the Vikings, let's say they arose in the, let's call it the 9th century, let's call it 790 onwards, and basically they were gone by the late 11th century, 1066 we'll call the last battle of the Vikings. But the Vikings turned into the knights. I mean, they became Jerusalem farers. One of the things that defined them in the real world was their willingness to attack Christian targets. And once they'd been converted to Christianity and pivoted around and started attacking Muslims instead, suddenly they were crusaders. They weren't Vikings anymore. And so there is this kind of developmental curve where a Viking becomes a crusader, where a Viking becomes a knight. Similarly, a lot of the technology of what makes the knights what they are, you could almost argue that a Chinese version of the knight developed into a samurai. The problem with the samurai, in terms of this discussion that we're having now, is that they arose around the same time as the Vikings, until say 8th or 9th century. But the last identifiable battle between people that we might call samurai was in 1877. It was the inspiration for the Tom Cruise film Last Samurai. Yes, with a name that I ought to be able to remember. The Last Samurai is a very evocative. I mean, it's a very odd film, but to me as a historian, it really encapsulates the feeling, the oddness of the last Japanese Civil War, because you do have samurai charging Gatling guns. And so we're dealing with the samurai. When you ask me a question about what did the samurai do, I have to pick an answer from 1,000 years of history. Whereas when you ask a question, what did the Vikings do, you're talking about a 300-year period, which even then has variance within it.
Absolutely.
So yes, I would say that it's possible. It's possible that a samurai weapon would penetrate a knight's armor. And more importantly, I think you wouldn't be able to throw it back at the samurai either. I mean, the samurai arrows were designed to be very fragile, so that they broke on impact and you couldn't immediately reuse them. And this is something I've only really appreciated recently, because I've been reading a diary of an archaeologist who was in Japan in the 1880s, and he had some samurai arrows, and he tried to use one as a letter opener, and it broke. And he's like, what kind of rubbish is this? But it was actually designed to be like a Roman pilum. It was designed as like a single-use weapon that couldn't be repurposed by the enemy. So yes, it's possible, but does that help? I don't know if it does, because anything's possible, in the right conditions.
I feel like we've discussed the perception in popular culture that samurai fight with a katana and wouldn't do anything dishonorable.
I don't know. I could probably go into that a bit more if you like.
Then go for it. I think if we want to delve into that one more properly.
Well, the matter is dishonor. The matter here is dishonor. As I said, you're telling the stories after the period where it happened, and you're trying to make everybody sound honorable. And particularly in the Tokugawa period, you're trying to you're trying to set up this mythology that says the samurai are these courtly people who would never do a wrong thing, because the samurai are now the government. The people who are telling you this are the government now, and they're saying we are nice people. We would never vote to leave the European Union. We know exactly what is best for you because we are honourable people. And even in our battles in our good old days, we never stabbed anyone in the back. No, we found a peasant and we gave him a fiver and we got him to stab you in the back. And then we pretended it was a happy accident. These stories are always told by the winning side, and the thing to remember with the samurai is that even during their days of battle, the art of war, Sun Tzu's art of war, was their main touchstone. It was their main manual, and it's a fantastic book for working out how best to kill your enemies and drive them before you. And there's only 13 chapters in the art of war. One of them is about espionage, and another one is about the uses of fire. And so, right through the samurai period, there are incidences of these outrageous backstabbing routines, of sneak attacks. There's one samurai lord who was killed in his toilet by someone stabbing up through the what's it called? Oh, the latrine. And of course there is a huge subgenre of stories about ninja, which is all bollocks, based entirely on 20th century thrillers from the 1950s onwards, and related in fact to the American occupation of Japan, where after 1945, for 7 years, Allied forces were occupying Japan and were running it as a kind of province, and they banned all mention of samurai. They banned all mention of the aristocracy that led the Japanese into World War II. And this meant, after 1,000 years of samurai history, you couldn't talk about them. And so one of the things that some of the left-wing writers of manga and of novels did was to invent this underclass of assassins and say, well, all these battles that happened in history, well, what we actually know is that there were these secret men in black who did all the dirty work, and they were peasants, they weren't samurai, so it's okay for us to talk about them now. And so you get this sudden kind of upwelling of stories about ninja. And someone capitalizes on that by starting up their own martial art called ninjutsu, and then they make You Only Live Twice, and they make a James Bond film in Japan, and suddenly they're ninja, which was a fading fad in Japan by the late 60s, by the early 60s. Suddenly ninja are all over the world. Everyone's saying, well, it's a true story. That's how these things happened. None of it's true. But there was certainly low-ranking samurai happy to try something risky. There's all kinds of stuff that went on at the siege of Hara Castle, which is during the Shimabara Rebellion. The samurai from Kumamoto were notorious nutters who would just try anything. They got a giant truck of gunpowder and rolled it into a tunnel to see if it would blow the tunnel up. And they sent assassins in with ropes tied to them so they could pull them back if there was trouble. And the people in the castle were fighting back by pouring all their chamber pots down into the tunnel as the other samurai were trying to fight their way in. There are all kinds of dirty tricks, even in the sagas themselves. Even in, say, the Heike Monogatari, which is the story of the battles between the Taira and the Minamoto, you have these stories of tying firebrands to the front of cattle and then driving them in a stampede through the enemy camp. And you have Yoshitsune leading a cavalry charge down a very steep slope into the back of the enemy camp. In later years, if someone tried that and they were on the wrong side, or someone didn't like them, someone would say, well, that's a horrible, dirty trick, how dare you? But because it's Yoshitsune and it's in the Heike Monogatari, everyone goes, yeah, what a great tactic, Sun Tzu would really approve. So I think it's very important to bear in mind the amount of guff that's been written about samurai honor, not just in Japan, but abroad in the last 200 years. And it's really important to remember that the word Bushido, as we understand it, was coined in 1900 by a Japanese author writing in English, and it only entered common parlance in Japan when that book was translated back into Japanese. So the samurai era for the Japanese is incredibly important because it's not just 1,000 years of martial history, but it's 250 years of this police state where they were in charge of everything. And also, after the Olympics in the late 60s, there was this castle building scheme all around Japan where all the kind of money they had left over from the Olympics, they stuck up all these new castles everywhere. So in places like, during the Tokugawa period, you only allow one castle per district, so they dismantled
Yeah.
all the others. But if you go to Japan now, it seems like every single town has got a bloody castle in the middle of it because they look good and they function nicely as town halls and they're
Yeah.
magnets for tourism. And so the kind of samurai have started to dominate Japan's sense of itself again. But it's a relatively recent phenomenon. And because it's a recent phenomenon and the ninja are now taking the credit for all the dirty tricks, the samurai are all
Hmm.
noble and lovely. And I find that very difficult to believe.
Isn't it? Yeah. Well, what it seems to be is that honor. Well, I think you've said this a number of times, but I guess in a sentence, honor seems to be written by the victor, basically.
Yes.
And that I find it interesting. Yeah. So because one thing that has just been announced for For Honor is Shinobi.
Uh-huh.
Uh, so
Don't get me started.
yeah. So I mean, what I find interesting then is because here's a couple of the discussions that have been going around. So whenever Shinobi were being talked about and leaked that they may be coming into the game, a number of people online said no, that's impossible. The samurai never had anything like ninjas. They didn't have Shinobi. They were honorable people and all this stuff. When in actual fact, they didn't have ninja or they didn't have Shinobi. It seems that all of this dirty work was
Well,
simply samurai.
yes, certainly. And if you ever want to track down Stephen Turnbull and get to him to talk to you about Ninja, you'll have a blast because he's got a new book coming out about Ninja where he deconstructs everything that's ever been written about Ninja and shows you all the cracks in it. And it's absolutely fascinating. I desperately want to tell you some of the things I know about his book because they're shocking in how. But I'll leave it to Stephen Turnbull to reveal these things about how recent the
Yeah.
word ninja is, for example. The word shinobi simply means stealth, person of stealth or a tough.
Yeah.
And there are points as early as the 17th century where you see it turning up. It's not shinobi with a capital S. It's not a type of thing. It is just a thing that people do. And I keep harking back to the Shimabara Rebellion because in the case of the Shimabara Rebellion, I have gone back literally to the original samurai documents and read what they say, and I've got a concordance of what every document says about the period. And the word shinobi only turns up once in the story of the Shimabara Rebellion, and when it does turn up,
Yeah.
it's a reference to scouts. And they send some guys over to the next hill to have a look at what's going on the next island, and then they come back again. This is not ninjutsu.
Yeah.
And one of the problems that we have with modern fad for ninja studies is there's a lot of manuals of ninjutsu. There's a lot of samurai manuals which have been repurposed and republished as manuals of ninjutsu. And what they are is meditations on the last chapter of Sun Tzu's Art of War, because samurai would write. There are thousands of books about military tactics written in the last 300 years of the samurai period by retired samurai and armchair historians and sometimes samurai themselves. The most famous one is the Book of Five Rings by Miyamoto Musashi, but frankly, that was of little interest whatsoever to the Japanese until the 1930s and 40s when Eiji Yoshikawa's biography of him was dramatized on the radio and he became this big kind of celebrity. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, Musashi was just some other guy who'd written one of these books. And many of these books, like the Bansen Shukai, for example, it's difficult to prove that anyone ever read it. It's something that was left in someone's attic. The illustrations are very suspiciously retroactively added to make it look more ninja-y. And the translations are very suspicious as well, because someone will helpfully translate shinobi as ninja when actually that's not what we're talking about here at all. So undoubtedly, the samurai had stealth tactics. Quite probably, they had units within their army who dealt with the dirty tricks. But the degree to which those are the ninja of legend, I don't know. I'm actually rather impressed that if For Honor is bringing in this kind of idea, that they're calling them shinobi. Because that is a fantastic get-out clause that cuts off a lot of arguments where they start. It's calling them ninja is where the problem begins, because the word ninja is a very, very recent invention.
Yeah, it did definitely bring in I think some of the arguments were that shinobi and ninja were simply a Chinese fad. I think that's what I had read, which I didn't agree. Even with my incredibly limited knowledge of Japanese and Chinese history, I think I simply felt it was common sense to assume that, well, I'm pretty sure Japanese culture would have developed some form of espionage. I think
Absolutely,
to say that
absolutely.
they were so honourable that they wouldn't have done anything
No.
stealthy is a little bit of a
No, but also Sun Tzu
yeah.
says the best way to victory is not to fight at all. And this is what you have to
Absolutely.
bear in mind about Sun Tzu is that I realize now we're talking about Chinese people, but Sun Tzu is vitally important for understanding the Japanese mindset as well, because
Yeah.
he is the manual that the Japanese did their best to follow, and so many of the Japanese manuals are merely meditations upon Sun Tzu. So as I said, there's a whole chapter on espionage in Sun Tzu, but also the thing to remember with him is that he hated war. He was he was the biggest pacifist I've ever run into. And Sun Tzu's Art of War, there's a whole chapter in there about what war's going to cost you politically.
Yeah.
And this is designed to scare the willies out of any politician who thinks that war is an easy option, because he's saying you're going to lose, their families are going to be broken up, you're going to be throwing money away that you're never going to get back. This is how much it costs to send an army this far. This is how much it costs to keep the army there. This is how much it costs in occupation and defenses against counterattack. He's desperately trying to talk people out of it. And so the message that you get by the time you get to the end of the Art of War is absolutely the last resort, and that Sun Tzu, if given control over a military budget, will do literally anything he can to avoid conflict. And this is why there's a whole chapter on espionage. This is why he says, if we got a spy, if we have an embedded spy who assassinates Hitler, or whatever the Chinese equivalent would be, before he can declare war, then and that spy is executed, we've lost one person and we've saved thousands of lives. This is surely better than actually going into battle. And so the samurai who internalized the message of Sun Tzu would undoubtedly work on the same principle. They would do everything they could to avoid battle.
So folks, that is all I want to share today. I thought it would be better to split this interview up into parts rather than leave it as an hour-long video like we did with the Viking discussion, but I hope you've enjoyed it. The rest of the interview will be coming soon, but until then, if you want to be notified of when new videos go live here on the channel, feel free to hit the subscribe button. But in the meantime, hope you're having a great week, and I'll speak to you soon.